I met Barbara at the Cross Keys, long blonde hair and pretty blue eyes, and built like you wouldn't believe. Richie was the only unmarried man in the group. She became friendly with him so she could always be around. Pretty slick, huh? But he was just an excuse. Barbara Roode had her eyes on me, and I wasn't exactly blind either. We stayed away from each other as long as we could. We talked some, but we never did anything. Finally, I went to Houston to have some talks with the record label there, and she came down. It was the first time we were together. Now, she was never comfortable with what we were doing, and neither was I. Still, it was hard to keep away, and we started seeing each other on the sly. I'd have to go over to her house in the daytime. Barbara was a golden girl and a dear heart. Her dad had invented a cotton machine that picked up cotton between the rows that the bowl puller would miss. He was worth about $30 million, I guess, and she had a lot of money. She even bought a car the same color of mine. She was definitely more of a party girl than Lynn. I wrote Anita, You're Dreaming about her when we first got together. I had most of it done, and Don Bowman helped me finish it. I was telling her that it didn't look like I was ever going to get loose from Lynn. She was young and deserved a better deal than I could offer. She was dreaming if she thought it could ever happen. But dreams have a way of revealing the truth. And when I left Lynn, I went straight to Barbara. That wasn't the only fantasy crossing the line into reality. Don became friends with Bobby Bear, who had scored hits with 500 miles away from home in Detroit City. Now, Bowman was telling him about me, and he got to find out for himself when he was driving through Phoenix one night, and he heard Just to Satisfy You on the radio. In Nashville, Chet Atkins. He said he wanted to record it. Now, Chet was familiar with Just to Satisfy You because Don Bowman had been bugging him with it. But he turned it over and said, hell, this is the one I want to do. So they wound up doing both. Four Strong Winds was on the other side, and it turned out to be a big hit for Bobby. The next time Bobby came through Phoenix in November 1964, he headed over after his gig to J.D.'s, and we did a duet of Just to Satisfy You. He had the next day off, so he came over to see me and the band play, somewhere between Phoenix and Las Vegas the next day. He got to thinking about it, and he stopped at a payphone. Chet, he said, I've just seen Waylon, and he's the best thing since Elvis. Now, he's so good that he deserves to be on a major label. Chet had heard similar praises from Skeeter Davis, who had called him at home to tell him he should sign me, and Dwayne Eddy. It wasn't like an agent or a manager coming in and hyping somebody. That don't mean too much. But coming from Bobby Bear, who liked country, folk, and had been a part of rock and roll, the recommendation really meant something. We loved the same songs. Bobby gave Chet my phone number. To be on RCA and have Chet Atkins produce you, to have him call you and tell you that he'd like to sign you, and never even seen me. I'll never forget the day. I was sitting home, and I could hear this real kind, gentle voice on the other end of the phone. And he was saying, we sure would like to have you on RCA. Would you be interested? Would I be interested? It was impossible to say no. That was the ultimate. RCA, or Victor. I'd seen it on so many Jimmy Rogers and Carter Family 78s. RCA meant country music, almost from the very beginning, dating back to Bristol, Tennessee sessions, organized by Ralph Peer in 1928. And Chet Atkins was a legend. Not only was he a well-regarded A&R executive, but he could put a gold seal on your career. He was a musician's musician, an originator who had his own Gretsch guitar named after him, the country gentleman. He was Sonny Curtis's idol. I started out for Nashville with a yellow Cadillac and a yellow-haired woman. It was a big step for me, a chance I was taking, and I was anxious to get started. I'd thought long and hard about leaving Phoenix, even asking another RCA artist passing through town what he thought about me moving. His name was Willie Nelson, and he had been having success as a songwriter. Crazy and funny how time slips away for Patsy Cline were already standards, and Fair and Young's Hello Walls was well on its way of becoming a classic. He was a fellow Texan appearing across town at the Riverside Ballroom. We had never met before, but my first album was about to come out, and he had just gotten his start recording as an artist in his own right. Now, he liked my singing, and I liked his. Willie came to town and sent word that he'd like to meet me. I went over to the Adams Hotel. I spent the afternoon finding out how much we had in common, asking him about Nashville and what I might expect. He had just moved there himself. I told him I had a good deal at J.D.'s. By then, I was making maybe $1,500 a week clear. Not bad for a sit-down job, as we called gigs that we didn't have to go on the road for. Don't move, he told me, and if you do, let me have the job. As usual, I followed the opposite course. I'd been in Nashville a couple of times during the previous year, 1965, looking around, cutting songs with Chet, and generally getting the feel of the city. I'd been there once before Bobby saw me and tried to see if I couldn't get something going, and all I found was doors closed. I didn't know anybody then, and nobody knew me. 8 months later, Chet's blessing had made all the difference. I was the talk of the town. When I arrived, it was at Nashville's invitation, and along the grapevine the word was out. Sometimes you don't need a hit record. If you go somewhere and sit down and make enough noise, they'll know it's you that they want, and they came to me. Bobby Bear put me up when I officially came to town to record for RCA as an artist. I spent 3 days in mid-March, and for the record it was the 16th, 18th, and 19th, cutting most of what would become my first album, Folk Country. In those sessions, we recorded 12 songs, including my first single, That's a Chance I'll Have to Take, as well as a couple of B-sides. My first single came out in May, and Chet called me back to Nashville on July 28th to cut a few more songs for the album. Among the newer things that I did was Anita, You're Dreaming. By the time I came back for the third time in the middle of February 1966, cutting a variety of material that ranged from That's What You Get for Loving Me to the Beatles' Norwegian Wood, Stop the World and Let Me Off had gotten into the top 15, and Anita was riding midway in the country charts. Folk Country was coming out the next month. Chet had declared March Male Singer Month at RCA, and the company was riding high with 10 entries in the top 25, including, along with me, Porter Wagner, Eddie Arnold, Hank Lachlan, and Jim Reeves, Archie Campbell, and Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler with Ballad of the Green Berets. I still needed a place to live and a way to feed the band. Now, the second priority was probably more urgent, because we almost starved when we first came to Nashville. Until my records started selling, I was not going to be a big money man. Even then, a hit country album could only be counted on for selling about 20 to 30,000 copies. W.E. Lucky Moeller, a booking agent, had promised to keep me working, which in Lucky's terms meant I wouldn't be home very much. Lucky sold volume. His principle was to keep the Billies on the road. He might play 3 or 4 times a year at the Flame in Minneapolis or the Horseshoe in Toronto, crisscrossing the country with hardly any rhyme or reason. To keep the band busy, he would discount them to a lower price. I'd be on the road all the time, generating Lucky's 10% by the week and 15% for one-nighters. And it would get me a lot of public exposure. Before I'd left Phoenix, I talked with John Cash about sharing an apartment when I got to Nashville. I met John through June Carter, who had crossed my path years before when I was still a disc jockey in Lubbock. But the closer I got to calling him up when I arrived, the worse the idea seemed. I was hanging out with Barbara, and even though I'd gotten to know John a little bit, there was still something of a starstruck teenager in me who had heard Cry, Cry, Cry over the radio. Beyond what we saw in each other's performers, we had a mutual respect centered around songs that we knew as kids. Our backgrounds were so similar, sharing poor cotton fields and a love for music all the way back as far as we could remember. You ever hear this one was the way our conversations usually started. And it didn't stop until we challenged each other all the way back to Vernon Del Hart and Carson Robinson in the 20s. We shared the music more than anything else. Later, I went to see him in Albuquerque with Tex Ritter opening. Now, John told me that he was thinking about moving to Nashville. He was having some trouble at home trying to get June to marry him, and he needed a place to flop down or what we'd call crash. Why don't we get an apartment together, he asked. It was just a regular one-bedroom on the first floor of the Fontaine Royal Apartments in Madison, right off Gallatin Road. Barbara moved down the hall about 4 or 5 doors away, which made it really convenient.